One of the things that always strikes me traveling up through the heartland of the country is all of the things that God has blessed us with as a nation and all of the abundance and the bounty. So much of this nation's history is tied up in that area as far as the settlement of the North American continent. As you travel up through the entire Midwestern region, you see just the endless fields of grain and the pasture land with cattle stretched out as far as the eye can see on the hills and out into the distance. And you are impressed once again with the bounty that God blessed this land with. In fact, I guess virtually almost the entirety of our trip, all the way up and back, was made through states that were a part of the Louisiana Purchase. As you go on up through Arkansas and Missouri and through Iowa and through Kansas and Nebraska and on up through the Dakotas, all of that area, all of that region was, of course, a part of the Louisiana Purchase. And here, all Thomas Jefferson wanted to do was to buy New Orleans, and they just threw the rest of it in, raised the price a little bit, and he got virtually a third of the continent thrown in for lagniappe, just trying to buy the port of New Orleans. If you've ever figured it, I think that if you take the acreage that was contained in Louisiana Purchase, we obtained that something in the neighborhood of about a nickel an acre is the price on that in terms of what Napoleon sold it for, as it was time for this nation to begin to blossom out and to begin to receive the blessings that God had promised to Abraham. One of the things that I couldn't help but think about, in fact, I bought a couple of little postcards in St. Joseph, Missouri. St. Joseph, Missouri was the stepping off point for the West, the settlement of much of the West. That was the headquarters of the Pony Express. And the couple of little postcards there that had reprinted on them the original advertisement that ran back in 1860 when they were setting up the Pony Express, and they reproduced the poster on one side of the postcard, of course the other side before you could address it and write the message. And it was interesting reading the postcard. The Pony Express only lasted for less than 2 years. It was started in 1860 and it was over by 1861, because by that time the telegraph wires had been strung across the continent, and once the telegraph was installed, well, then the telegraph was able to beat the Pony Express. It took the Pony Express from St. Joseph, Missouri to San Francisco. It took them about 9 days, which is about what it'll take the post office today. If you mail a letter, try to get it from one end to the other. They've not improved a whole lot on the Pony Express in terms of timing, but it was interesting the advertisement. They wanted they advertised for young single fellows under 18, must be skinny and wiry, orphans preferred. That was what they had right on there. Orphans preferred. Now, they preferred orphans because they figured that the mortality rate was going to be pretty high. And they figured the less people they had to worry about them, the better off it was. And you recruit some of these young fellas, and if they didn't have any family, well, something happened to them, the Indians shoot them or whatever, there wouldn't be a whole lot of people around to really grieve about it. And we sort of shake our heads at that, but that literally is who comprised the Pony Express. It was a dangerous run. You started out in St. Joseph, Missouri, all the way across just a trail, not even a graded gravel road, but across a trail that every so often there were stations where they could change horses, and then at certain points they would switch out riders. But there were Indians, there were marauders, there were all sorts of things along the way. And, of course, every now and then they would get to where they were supposed to switch out, and they would find that somebody had been there and had burned the station, or the horses had been scattered or whatever, and they just had to go on. an incredible thing, and yet it was a part of the settling of this country. There were people who were willing to answer the. Oh, and by the way, but the pay was pretty good. They must have been enticed to do it because of the pay. They got $25 a month, so they were really paid big money on doing that. But there were young fellows that did, and the number of a lot of that has been legendary in terms of the history of this country, as Americans have always been inspired by those who were willing to be pioneers, by those who were willing to risk their lives, who were willing to step out and to do things that were important to the settling of this country, to beginning to tie together communications in this nation, that a means of communicating from the East Coast to the West Coast. And you consider, that was the amount of time that it took on some of these things that were there. Well, not only did the Pony Express have its beginnings there in St. Joseph, Missouri, but St. Joe was also the starting point for most of the wagon trains going west. Now, sometimes if you watch old Western movies on television or something, you've seen that, and the fact that St. Joe was the main staging point for the wagons going west. Now, there was a reason for that, because you could navigate and come up the Mississippi River, come up to St. Louis. That was a fairly simple matter during those years in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, 1870s, to come on up to St. Louis up the Mississippi, and even to navigate from St. Louis coming up the Missouri River, navigating out on the old paddle wheelers, coming on up toward St. Joe, because the Missouri River, of course, flows down from the west, from the northwest, and flows into the Mississippi there at St. Louis. But as it comes down, it is pretty much of going west from St. Joe down to St. Louis. It's west and just slightly to the southwest as it comes down from St. Joe to St. Louis. But when you get to St. Joe, the Missouri then begins to head north more and takes a much more northwesterly direction. And so as they would come from St. Louis and come to St. Joe, it was at St. Joe that they crossed the Missouri River and then began to head west. And the trails diverged out, whether it was going toward California, which is where, of course, Lot went, or the Oregon Trail diverged off from there, going on up toward the northwest, about 3 major trails. And as these wagons went west through that period of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, it was something that played a major part in terms of the settling of the country. But it was not an easy way to travel. It was a very difficult journey. It was a dangerous journey. A lot of people who undertook that journey never survived to get to the other end. Now, the people who left St. Joe on the wagon trains were excited. They had high hopes. They had great dreams. They anticipated a new beginning, a fresh start in life. They anticipated all of the things that they had heard. Because you remember, there had been gold that had been found in California in 1849, which really caused sort of an explosion of settlement. The population of California just mushroomed in the aftermath of that, because people back further east would hear about the gold that had been discovered and decided that this was the solution to all of their problems. So they were going to go and they were going to go out there to California. And of course, a little later on in the 1860s, right around the beginning, just prior to the onset of the war between the states, there was mining that began up in Nevada, up in the area of Virginia City. If you remember the setting of the old Bonanza show, that was right out there, the area of what was called the Comstock Lode there in that area, that really turned out to be a silver mine primarily rather than gold, but again caused a tremendous surge in people coming west as places would grow from simply a collection of lean-tos and tents to within a couple of years of regular towns, a small city of several thousand people and permanent buildings. An incredible amount of things happened, and yet as people were going from the east to the west, coming across, it was a difficult and an arduous journey. They encountered, of course, Indians along the way, who in many cases were hostile. Not all of them were, but some were. They encountered robbers and people, marauders along the way who would hijack a wagon train, burn it out, kill the people, probably shoot a few arrows at it to try and blame it on the Indians anyway, and would loot whatever was there that they could sell, and would sell it either to Indians or sell it to other people, whoever it was that they could sell it to, because it was difficult to get supplies from the east to the west. And so a lot of times when these wagon trains would start out, people would load them down. They'd put everything that they thought they were going to want on the wagon. They load down everything from pianos and pump organs to you name it. That would be piled up and hitch up a big team of oxen there to these wagons and begin to head west. Well, it was a journey that was not something to be undertaken lightly. The people who made it generally had liquidated their assets. They had invested everything they had was tied up in that wagon and in those and the teams that were pulling the wagon. And the journey they were going to be taking was over a trail. And there were a lot of things that could be said of not only the problems with enemies who would attack, whether it be Indians or whether it would be white robbers and thieves. That was a problem, but just the very physical difficulties encountered by crossing the continent. Having to ford the rivers and certainly having to cross the great expanse of what's known as the Great American Desert was one of the most dangerous things because of the area that had to be gone through where they could not replenish supplies at all, where the water was pretty well used up by the time they got to the other end. And as they would travel through, they could simply look to either side and they could see the remains of those who had not made it that had gone before, because it was a very common sight to see bleached out white bones of oxen or mules and even people lying off in the distance to the side of the trail, to see the skeletal framework of some of these wagons that had been burned out and just perhaps some of the iron frame of the wagon that was left. And they could look off in the distance and they could see these things. They could see the fact that there were others who had the same hopes and dreams that they had that had never successfully completed that journey. So there were very difficult and adverse circumstances that they had as they traversed the continent. They had to cross the Rocky Mountains, and that there were only a few places where that was possible because you had to follow a trail up through a pass, and there were only very few areas where that could be done in wagons, the way that was at that time. And you had to, as you're going up into the elevation, of course, snow starts earlier, winter starts earlier, you had to make the pass by a certain time, because if the weather had turned bad and the passes became snowbound, you were simply trapped and you would die. Because by the time that the snow set in the mountains, if you were trapped there and couldn't make it through and get across to the other side of the mountain, your provisions, there was no way you could really survive if you were caught too late on, because by this time, of course, what happens? The game begins to work its way down the mountains. You know, they're going down where they can find something to eat. So the deer and buffalo and various other animals that were in abundance out there, the antelope, the elk, all of these animals that were in abundance out there, they weren't up there during the coldest part of the winter. They were in areas where they could find food. So They had the difficulty and the adversity of having to make it, of having to stay on the track, on the trail, on schedule. And as they would make the journey through, I think one of the saddest things that caused so many needless deaths was the fact that during the time of difficulty and adversity, as they were crossing some of the sections of the Great American Desert, was that they would look out in the distance and be absolutely convinced that they had found water that was not on the map. There was a lake out there. They could clearly see the water, they thought. What they saw, of course, was a mirage, which is not uncommon in the desert. Particularly, they're common in the areas of a dry lake bed out in the desert. The reflection of the heat waves and everything tends to create the illusion that you're seeing water. And there were those who would start out heading toward the mirage, and others would tell them, that's not real, that's not what we're after. But they were convinced, they knew that by this time, of course, the animals were thirsty, and animals, in some cases, were even dying. They were down to half rations or quarter rations of water as they were getting toward the end of this trek across the desert. And they would take off in pursuit of what they thought was the answer, the solution. And in the pursuit of that mirage, very few who pursued a mirage lived to tell the tale. Some did. Some recognized early enough that they were heading the wrong way, that they were off the track, and they were able to turn around and get back on the trail. But there were others who did not recognize it until the last minute. The problem was you got into these dry lake bed areas, and there was a crust that had formed on top, and the wagon wheels broke through it, and the oxen, in their weakened condition, simply could not pull them out of it. And the only alternative someone would have been to have cut loose the wagon, to have left everything they had behind, and to have taken one of the animals and tried to get out simply with that. Most of them, when they recognized that they were bogged down, wasted the energy that they had left trying to extricate themselves. And when they finally realized they couldn't get the wagon out, they had so exhausted themselves and their resources that it was too late, and they died. And any wagon train coming through after the original ones could look out and they could see the remains. They could see the warnings. But it was a continual problem. It was a continual difficulty that plagued the wagon trains as long as they crossed that stretch. And in some cases, even something had happened to the wagon master, to the one who was the leader of the wagon train, someone who was relatively inexperienced took over. In some cases, even the whole wagon train, or the majority of it, took off in the pursuit of a mirage. And there were those, of course, who recognized that they're getting off the track, they're getting off the trail, they're pursuing a mirage, they're not after the real thing, and they refused to go. But you recognize that all of these things that took place and these things that individuals went through in the pursuit of a new life, in pursuit of carving out a home, of building a farm. And what did they find when they finally got where they were going? They found a wilderness that had to be cleared out. They didn't get there, and find a home that was built and stocked and fields plowed and fences built and land cleared. When they finally arrived, then there was more work. The work of having to build up everything from scratch. But when you go through there now, and you look out at those hills, and you see just as far as the eye can see, you see wheat or you see corn. You see cattle by the thousands just stretched across to the horizon, way out, all across these hills. As you look around, you see the grass that is there, and you see as you drive along for just mile after mile, and you see this beautiful, rich, verdant farmland that is stretched out there as far as the eye can see. And you recognize that it was definitely worth having. It was worth sacrificing for. It is the area of the country that has been the breadbasket of the world. But there were difficulties and adversities that had to be gone through in order to ever get there, to settle it, to make it productive. Now, what we are going through as God's people is in many ways analogous to what our forebears went through in terms of the crossing of the west, of the wagon trains leaving St. Joe and heading west, and of course settling all that area on up into the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, which was basically an area that was empty at the time when the United States acquired it. In the Scriptures we have an example that is clearly drawn that what we are going through as Christians is likened to a journey. It's likened to a trip. When you go back to Hebrews 11, you read of the men and women that God had called and dealt with, the fact that they responded to God's calling, and they went where God led. You read of Abraham, who was called to physically make a journey. God said, up, get you out of this land, out of this place, away from your father's house, away from your kindred, and go to a land that I will show you. And we're told that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, and he journeyed to the land of Canaan. Abraham believed God. Hebrews 11 tells us that he looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. Now, Abraham saw that city through faith. When he got to the land of Canaan, he didn't see that city, but he saw it in his mind. He believed the reality of it, he was convinced of it, and he was prepared to do whatever it took. On a physical level, our forebearers in this nation made a journey. They left the eastern parts of the country and they traveled west. And in their mind, they saw something that went beyond the difficulties and the adversities and the enemies and went beyond all of these things. They saw the potential, they saw what was there, and they believed in what could be built and developed. And they were prepared to undergo great adversity in order to be a part of that. Abraham was called to physically leave Ur of the Chaldees and to make a journey. Moses was called to physically leave Egypt and go through the Sinai wilderness and bring Israel up to the promised land. The land of Canaan, the land that had been promised to Abraham so many centuries earlier. Now, when you go through Hebrews 11, you find that most of those there were not called upon to make a physical journey, but they were all called upon to make a journey. They were all called upon to travel a path. And that pathway was a spiritual pathway. They were called upon to leave behind this world, this society, this civilization. They were called upon to leave behind Babylon and to go to a place that God would show them. And they looked for and they anticipated the kingdom of God, the time when the kingdom of God will rule and reign and hold sway upon this earth. And God's government will be everywhere. When we look at the kinds of things that can be, at the richness and the abundance, when we think about the time when the whole world will be able to partake of this richness, of this abundance, of all of the things that we have so much of in this country. You know, we're going to have a meal in a relatively short amount of time. And we'll go through, and I dare say that none of us will go away hungry. Never been anything over here yet where anybody went away hungry. Now, all of us, take that for granted to an extent. But you realize that there are so many people living all around the world that something like this is far beyond what they could even begin to aspire to. And yet it seems very basic and very fundamental to us. We anticipate and we look forward to a time when all the world will participate in a feast of fat things. Abraham saw a city whose maker and builder is God. And all of the men and women of faith in Hebrews 11 saw and were convinced of the reality of the promises of God, and they undertook a journey that was difficult, that was arduous, that had enemies along the way to undercut their path, that had difficult things that were in their way. And a lot of times mirages popped up too. Well, there are people all the way down who have gotten off the track. You get lost off the track and you pursue the wrong road. You go off in pursuit of a mirage. And it's not going to get you where you want to go. Well, we could look through. We find that the Bible has many illustrations and uses this. In fact, Paul drew the analogy in 1 Corinthians that what Israel of old went through in going through and journeying through the Sinai wilderness. He told us, he said, that Christians should look at that and realize that those things were an example. They were a pattern to us. They underwent a physical journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, and it illustrated the things that we can expect to encounter as we travel and make our spiritual journey. And he goes through and he gives those examples and those analogies. Many, many times through the Scriptures, the Christian life is compared to a journey. It is compared to a way that we must walk. We're told that, in 1 John that if we abide in Christ by walking as He walked. That's in 1 John 2:6. That's not talking about trying to figure out exactly how long His stride was and how long His step was, and you're trying to mimic, the way He walked, just as a physical person walking from, the front door to out in the yard. It's talking about a journey through life. That we abide in Him, if we really abide in Him, if we dwell in Him, then we're walking as He walked. We're conducting our life's journey in the way that He journeyed through life. It has to do with a journey that we are pursuing as Christians. Now, the pioneers of old, and we have been called to be the pioneers, along with all of the men and women of faith that God has called down through the centuries, we have been called to be the pioneers of a new world, a new age. Not a new age that is going to come by various political endeavors that man will achieve. Not a new age in the sense of Eastern mystic cults and all sorts of weird things that are increasingly gaining acceptance in this nation. But an age that is new because it is based not on old lies, but on the truth of God. And the truth of God is eternal, so it is always new, and it is always old. It is ever abiding with us. The truth of God endures to all generations. The truth of God continues and goes on. Now we find that as we conduct our journey and we follow God's way, as we pursue that we are pioneers, and the journey that we're undertaking is in many ways analogous to the pioneers of the past who followed the wagon trains west. Just as they had to be on the lookout for enemies attacking, so do we. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 tells us, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, your enemy, the devil, as a roaring lion walks about seeking whom he may devour. So we have an adversary, we have an enemy who is out to destroy. Just as there were those who were adversaries, who were enemies, who were out to destroy. The wagon trains headed west. Now what do we do about this adversary? Do we just sort of surrender and quit? Do we give up? Do we figure we're beaten before we start? Well, we're told in verse 9, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. But the God of all grace, who has called us unto His eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that you have suffered a while, make you perfect, make you complete, make you finished and mature, establish, strengthen, and settle you. God has called us what? He has called us unto His eternal glory. We've been called to share in that glory. We're going to see that in a few moments. You know, Jesus Christ, we were told in Hebrews, Paul says that talks about bringing many sons unto glory. Jesus Christ, the captain of our salvation, is bringing many sons of God unto glory. That's what we're called to be a part of the very family of God, sharing in God's glory. So, we've been called in this way, but we have something that lies between us and the achievement, the accomplishment. You know, the pioneers didn't get in a comfortable airplane, take off from London's Heathrow Airport, sit down in New York at the airport and get on a train or something and just sort of travel across and come. All of a sudden they get off the stop and there's their farm, you know. The beautiful house, barns are built, fences are in, livestock are out there grazing, and you know somebody's already put in the garden, planted the crops, oats in the field for the cattle, and hay in the hayloft, and all they've got to do is just sort of go out and collect the eggs from the hen house and pluck the tomatoes off the vine and make the bed perhaps, and they just sort of settle back and enjoy it all. Obviously, that was not the way it was at all. There were difficulties. There were great adversities, and it was something that had to be built and it had to be developed. We're told that God has called us to something that's a lot better, a lot greater, a lot more magnificent than the most wonderful things that have been built up and developed in the American West. We're told we've been called to His eternal glory. But their adversaries we're going to have to face. There are difficulties that lie between us and where it is that ultimately we're going to be. So there are adversaries that we have to face. Enemies that are there to attack. Now when you read the Bible, you find that the people of God have always faced enemies and adversaries. Sometimes those adversaries have attacked from without. Sometimes those adversaries have attacked from within. You can go back, you can read the stories in Ezra and Nehemiah, you can read various accounts all the way through. Read the books of Kings and Chronicles. See how many times the problems lay within. And you know that happened in that happened with the wagon trains west. It was not unheard of that some who were going to hijack a wagon train and hijack what was being taken would plant individuals along in that wagon train to try and demoralize the settlers and to create discord and confusion and to undermine their being able to effectively stay together and complete their journey. That would do what they could to undermine things from within and to weaken so that a frontal assault, an attack when it came, would not be able to be resisted. So we're warned that if we're going to successfully complete our journey, we've got to be on the alert for enemies who will attack, because we do have an enemy. We have an adversary who's clever, who's crafty, who's wily, who is absolutely without any compunctions of being unethical or fighting dirty. We have an enemy. And we have adverse conditions. We have difficulties that simply we live in a world that is very hostile to God's way of life. Just as our forebearers were going through an environment that was very hostile to trying to move large wagons pulled by teams of oxen, men, women, and children hauling all their possessions headed west. And, they did. They had everything from the milk cow tied, on behind the wagon and maybe a couple of chickens in the back. Because they were trying to take everything with them to start a new life. They had food, they had provisions, they had household items, they had all the things that they needed. They started out, and of course some of these things they found that they couldn't make it all the way through, and some of the animals would die. Some items that had been very precious and seemed awfully important when they left Philadelphia or even when they left St. Louis or St. Joe, by the time they were crossing the Rocky Mountains, some of those things didn't seem nearly so essential to life and were left along the way. But a lot of things did get through. The point is they had to endure a hostile environment, and we have to endure a hostile environment. We are traveling through hostile territory. We're traveling through territory that is not friendly or not conducive to the journey of the Christian life. Simply not. And we always have to be on guard of getting off the track. Because, those who got off the track found that they weren't taking simply an alternate route. They were on a one-way trek to nowhere. Because generally, if they depended on how far off the track they got, if they only got a little ways, they may be able to make it back. But if they got far enough off the track, they simply would not have the resources to get back where they needed to be. There was a point of no return. There was a point that they simply would be unable to reconnect, to get back close enough. In some cases, they were pursuing a mirage. They were pursuing an illusion. We've been called to pursue the real thing. In Ephesians Chapter 4, verse 17, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind." Now, this is how Paul told the people in Ephesus. This is how their neighbors were walking. This is how the other Gentiles were walking. The Greeks were walking in the vanity of their mind. They had this great vain idea of how much they knew and how smart they were, and nobody could tell them anything because they knew it all, had it all figured out. They were walking in the vanity of their mind. They were know-it-alls. Paul said in reality, they have their understanding darkened, verse 18, are alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them. Absolutely alienated from the way God intended people to live. And yet nobody can tell them anything because they're walking in the vanity of their mind. That's the way their journey is being pursued. Just as real the fact that they're walking a journey and pursuing a way that is a one-way ticket to oblivion. They're pursuing a mirage. They're chasing an illusion. They're chasing something that beckons, that is not reality, because ultimately it is only the kingdom of God and the glory that He offers that is reality. So verse 18 tells us, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart. Because of the blindness of their heart. Who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, unto lust. Just lawless lust. To work all uncleanness with greediness. Now, if you take uncleanness and greediness, you've got pretty much of a summation of what's going on in this nation. What's not motivated by lust is probably motivated by greed. Throw in a little jealousy and vanity, and you've just about got the whole thing. These are the motivating, ruling factors in life, in society. And the people who are pursuing those things are pursuing the wrong way. They're off the track. They have their mind blinded. They don't see it. They don't get it. They're pursuing a mirage. Colossians Chapter 1. Colossians 1 and verse 23 tells us, if you continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, where I Paul, am made a minister. You have to continue in the faith. You have to continue in the faith, grounded and settled. You've got to stay on track. To continue or to abide in the faith, grounded and settled. There is to be a stability to God's people. You know, if you were with a wagon train, and some, even if it was the majority, that was rare, but that did happen on one or two occasions, under inexperienced leadership, turned off the trail in pursuit of a mirage. Now, you didn't want to leave the wagon train. You know, you needed as many to stick together as you could to make the journey. And you had traveled all the way, you know, for hundreds of miles with these people. But when it came down to it, what are you going to do? Are you going to follow them off across the desert in pursuit of what you know to be a mirage? If you are, you're pursuing certain death. You know, you have to stay on the track. Sometimes one or two went off in pursuit of a mirage. In one or two cases, most of the wagon train went off the track in pursuit of a mirage. And the sun whitened bones that greeted the next wagon train the following year were evidence of what happened when someone got that far off the track. We are enjoying, we live in a world that is off the track, and we have seen from time to time down through the history of God's people those who have not continued in the faith, grounded and settled, but have gotten off the track in pursuit of a mirage. Because we are not to be moved away from the hope of the gospel. What is the hope of the gospel? What is the very hope to which we've been called? You know, Paul talks about down in verse 26 about the mystery that has been hidden from ages and generations is now being made, is now being even proclaimed among the Gentiles. The very riches of the glory of this mystery, verse 27, the magnitude and enormity of it, which is what? Christ in you, the hope of glory. Christ in you, the hope of glory. The hope of the gospel is the hope of glory, of being glorified with God as a part of the very family of God. That's the hope of the gospel. The hope of glory. Entering into the very glory of God. You know, Jesus Christ is the wagon master. And we've got to follow where He leads. He's the captain of our salvation. We find in Hebrews 2:10 it talks about bringing many sons unto glory. God is bringing sons to glory. The hope of glory is the hope of the gospel. We're being brought to glory. Christ anticipated, you can read it in His final prayer to the Father, recorded there in the book of John, that all of us would ultimately be glorified with the glory that Jesus Christ had shared with the Father. He asked, John 3, it talks about how It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know this, that when He shall appear, we shall be like Him. For we shall see Him as He is, in His glory, and we will be like that. We will be in glory. Go back and read 1 Corinthians 15. Now, there are various degrees of glory. You know, the sun has one level of glory, and the moon has another level. The stars have a different level, and the various stars differ from one another, but they are all glory. So also, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, is the resurrection. We will share in glory. We will be glorified sons of God. The real mystery is Christ in us. Christ living His life of overcoming in us through the indwelling of the very power of God, God's Holy Spirit, which enables us to overcome and to have God's righteous character indelibly imprinted in our hearts and minds so that we can ultimately be glorified in the resurrection. Paul anticipated being able to present those he was teaching in verse 28, perfect or complete, mature, finished. And he put forth effort to that end and to the end of in himself and his own life being there. That's why he said in verse 29, whereunto I also labor, striving according to His working, which works in me mightily. So Paul said, I put forth effort, I strive according to His working. It takes our cooperative effort with God. God doesn't do it all for us. And we certainly can't do it without His help. He says, I labor, I strive according to His working, which works in me mightily. You plug in the vacuum cleaner and sit in the chair and watch it. What happens? Nothing. It's plugged in. You may turn it on. It sits there and it runs. Doesn't clean the house. What happens if you don't plug it in? You can work all day and not have anything to show for it. The point is, it takes both. It takes the power and it takes your effort. And without the two working together, you're not going to have anything accomplished of value. That's the way it is in the Christian life. Paul says, striving according to His working. So Paul says, I pick it up and I get to work. I put forth effort. I put my energy and my effort into it according to His working, which works in me mightily. So God's providing the power, and I'm utilizing that power by putting forth my effort to be productive. So, we have a goal. We have a journey. And just as the pioneers of old had to fend off enemy attacks, had to survive adverse, difficult circumstances, and had to be very careful of staying on the track, so do we. We're going to successfully complete the Christian life. Now, not only do we have things that we have to be aware of in terms of trying to complete the Christian life, of the things that can subvert the successful completion of the journey, but we also find that we get to thinking, and it's not wrong that we should, we get to thinking of what we can do to help one another. Because, we are making a journey together. We've been called, and we want to help one another. We ought to want to help one another. We ought to be concerned about one another and love one another and have concern. What can you do to help one another? Well, there are several things. The most important teaching tool is example. That's the most powerful thing that we have, is our example. Jesus Christ taught by example. Now, He taught by explanation and admonition as well. He was in a capacity of teaching. Everyone can teach by example. We're not all in a position to teach by explanation or exhortation. That may not be our position or the relationship that we have with someone else. You come up and just start lecturing somebody, the odds are you're going to turn them off. That won't be effectively received. But every one of us can teach by example. From the youngest to the oldest, we can all set an example. Jesus said in John 13, you're familiar with the story, the account of the foot washing? And in John 13:14, he says, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash my feet. Now he said in verse 13, you call me Master and Lord. You say, well, for so I am. You treat me with respect, and you show that by the way that you address me, and that's appropriate, he told them, because I am your Lord. I'm your boss. I'm your master, your teacher, and you show respect to that, and that's fine. That's appropriate. If I have done this, if I've washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example that you should do as I've done unto you. I've given you an example. He didn't just tell them how to treat one another. He showed them how to treat one another. Now, he went on to explain it, but he set them an example. He illustrated it by the way that he himself did it. He set them an example. He showed them how to conduct themselves if they were in a position of authority. If you're in a position of authority, how should you conduct yourself? You know, he was the Lord. He was the Master. He was in a position of authority. What do you do? Make everybody grovel at your feet? No, according to Christ, you serve. So Christ taught by his example. Paul told Timothy along that line, you know, we see that example there in John 13. We're all familiar, I think, with the verse back in 1 Peter 2:21 where we're told that Christ suffered for us, setting us an example that we should follow in his steps. See, Christ made the journey. He successfully completed the journey. He blazed the trail. And we need to follow in his steps. He set us an example. He showed us how to do it. And all of us can set an example. We can set an example for one another. Christ taught by example and illustrated the importance of example. You know, Timothy faced a difficult situation. He was a young man. We're not told exactly how old, but perhaps probably in his 20s, maybe early to mid-20s at the time Paul wrote 1 Timothy to him. In 1 Timothy 4:12, Paul told him, he says, let no man despise your youth. Now, Timothy was in a difficult position because he was ordained as an elder and left there with a responsible position. You know, it's difficult to be a young man in that sort of circumstance. I could always relate to this. When I first came out in the field ministry, I was in my early 20s and was somewhat self-conscious of my age. You know, there was no way that you could suddenly be 35 or 45 when you're only 25. You just have to get there one day at a time. And there's no way you can sort of zap your age forward. And yet you find yourself in a situation where you're primarily dealing with people who are older than you. And that can be a difficult spot. That's something that back years ago was increasingly or was often the case simply because there were so few men that were available who the need was great in the field. And so this was a situation back at this time. Paul had put Timothy there. And Timothy was a young man, and there were those who tended to look down on him because of his youth. And he had probably talked to Paul about it and said, you know, there are some who really don't seem to have a lot of respect for me, sort of look down on me and figure I'm still wet behind the ears, and what can I do about it? So Paul is writing him and giving him advice, and he said, now here's what you do. Here's the way you deal with that. He says, let no man despise your youth, but be you an example. He said, Timothy, the way to have the people's respect is to be an example. Be an example of the believers. In word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. You set an example of the way a Christian ought to live. You let them see a maturity of your conduct. You're studying God's Word, then you have the source of the most mature wisdom of the universe. You've got the Word of God, truth of God. And you can't get more mature than God, so, as long as you stick to what God says, you're on pretty safe ground. He says, let no man despise your youth. Be you an example. Be an example. That's something all of us can do, you see, regardless of how young we are, how old we are. We can set an example. The most powerful teaching tool that there is our example. That's the most powerful teaching tool that we have. If you want to help someone, we want to help one another. We want to help others. The most important thing we can do is try to set an example. Be an example. Let them see the way we're living and the things we're doing. That's what Christ did. That's what Paul told Timothy to do when he was having some difficulties because people were sort of looking down on him and figuring, what does he know? He said, Timothy, be an example to them. Let them see your example. And that, in the long run, will speak far more loudly than all the things you say, what you do. One of the most important things we can do to help one another is be an example. Another thing is a very fundamental point that is made in the law, and that is simply to love your neighbor. Now, how do you do that in a practical sense? Everybody agrees, I love your neighbor. Well, it's spelled out back in the statutes in Leviticus 19. Let's notice here, Leviticus 19, pick it up in verse 16. You shall not go up and down as a talebearer among your people. Neither shall you stand against the blood of your neighbor. I am the Eternal. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall in any wise rebuke your neighbor and not suffer sin upon him. You shall not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Eternal. How do you love your neighbor? Well, you don't go up and down as a talebearer. You're not a gossip. You're not a rumor monger. You don't go around spreading rumors and gossip and accusation and speculation. Now, sometimes people see someone doing something. Now, it's possible they didn't see the whole thing. They may have only seen part of it, and what they thought they saw wasn't necessarily what really happened. And even if they did actually see what happened, then they get in trouble by jumping to conclusions as to why it was happening. I think Mr. Evans gave you some example of that last Sabbath when he gave the example there in the book of the book of Joshua, where the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh built a stone altar on the east side of the Jordan River. And a word got back. They were building this thing, piling up rocks. Well, that's right. They were piling up rocks. Piled up the stones. But when the word got back and people began to speculate as to what they were doing, pretty soon they were on the verge of a civil war and the nation was ready to go to blows. Because they were absolutely convinced, they're going into idolatry and they're building a pagan temple over there. That wasn't what they were doing at all. People jumped to conclusions. And it was, have you heard? Did you know? Boy, I can't believe what they're doing. So, don't go up and down as a talebearer among your people. People talk about others. If you've got something against someone, number one, you need to go to God. If you're going to say something to somebody, say something to the person. If something needs to be said, say something to the person. Don't say something to everybody except the person. Don't stir up and foment difficulty. That's not showing love to your neighbor. You're not to hate your brother in your heart. Don't hold a grudge. You don't try to get even or bear a grudge against the children of your people. If something needs to be said, go to the person and say it. It's talking in the context of sin. When it says don't suffer sin upon him, you're to rebuke your neighbor. It's talking about sin. Sin is the transgression of the law. It's talking about the violation of God's law. It's not talking about just the fact that he's not doing it quite the way you would do it. Not talking about just matters of personal preference or something of that sort. It's talking about a direct violation of the law. If you see something serious going on, you need to go and talk to the person, not go around and talk about them behind their back. But we're to have an attitude of loving our neighbor, not holding a grudge, not keeping track of things in a sense of trying to get even. Rumor mongering and holding a grudge and resentments and all this sort of thing. These are the things that undermine the love of neighbor. We love our neighbor by not gossiping and backbiting, by being willing to forgive, not attempting to get even. You know, Paul tells us back in Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 29, he says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers, and grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you're sealed until the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you." You know, one thing I can guarantee, all of us, none of us will ever have to forgive anyone else more than what God has forgiven us. You know, everything you and I have ever done, every sin we've ever committed, has been against God. Others may have done some things against us, but everything we've ever done has been against God. Every sin that we've ever committed has been against God. And so, God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven us, and we can have a forgiving attitude to one another. Certainly not an attitude of holding a grudge and holding a resentment, trying to get even. That's what really holding a grudge is, trying to avenge yourself, trying to get even. People get into trouble when they start judging the motives of what others are doing. And so, not to have corrupt communication, not to be doing this sort of thing. But again, how do you help one another? Well, we help one another by setting an example. We help one another by loving our neighbor. We show that love by a lack of gossip and backbiting, by an attitude of forgiving, not holding a grudge or resentment. You know, a third thing that we have to do in terms of that's important in terms of helping one another is a matter that we sometimes don't think of. And that is the fact that we have to recognize and accept that each of us must choose. Everyone must make choices, personal choices. The essence of what God has made us as a human being is that we have the right and the responsibility of choosing. Now, there's a right choice and a wrong choice. But God gives us the right and the responsibility to make choices. And we have to respect everyone's right to make choices. Deuteronomy 30 is a familiar account. This is where God told Moses to tell the children of Israel, as he said in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15, "I've set before you this day life and good, death and evil." And he goes through and he gives the instructions, and in verse 19 he says, "I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your seed may live." Now he told them what the alternatives were, and he told them what choice he hoped they would make. But God let the children of Israel make a choice. He let them choose. And sometimes we're unwilling. Someone should make a choice. We have to accept that people will make choices. That part of learning to apply God's law in our lives is that we all have to make choices. We make choices day by day. Some of them are big choices, some of them are little choices. In a few minutes we're going to be making choices going through the serving line. And have decisions, you know. And some of us will make good decisions, and some of us will regret our decisions, perhaps, a little bit later. You may regret that you didn't pick up. More likely, you regret that you did pick up. You're sort of like the character in the ad. I can't believe I ate the whole thing. But nevertheless, we have to make choices. And they can be choices in very routine, mundane areas of our lives. They can be choices of great significance. And in many cases, there are right choices and wrong choices. But we have to take responsibility for the choice we make. Now, Joshua told the children of Israel in Joshua 24:14, he said, "Fear the eternal and serve him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." Verse 15, he said, "Now, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord," you don't want to do that. "Choose you this day whom you're going to serve." Make a choice. You want to serve the gods that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates? You want to serve the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell? He says, "But as for me and my house, we've made our choice. We will serve the eternal." Joshua said, you have a choice to make. Now, I've made my choice. I know what we're going to do. I hope you will make the same choice, but it's your choice. You're going to have to make a decision in your life as to what you're going to do and which direction you're going to go. Brethren, we have to be willing to recognize one another's right to choose, to make choices. Some choices are good and some choices are bad. One thing to realize with choices is you have to take responsibility for what you choose. If you choose to pursue a mirage, you're going to get bogged down. And you may not be able to make it back on track. But that's your choice, and you're responsible for that choice. It's important that each of us individually examine what we're choosing and why we're choosing it. But we all, if we want to help one another, we're not going to help one another by trying to make others' choices for them, cramming them down their throat, trying to force them to fit into the mold that we want. Some people make better choices than others in their families and their dealings with their husbands, their wives, their children. Some people make good choices, some make bad choices, and some make maybe sort of mediocre choices in between. There are a variety of choices. But we have to respect one another's right to make choices. We have a responsibility before God to choose. As we learn to apply God's law in our lives, we're making choices day by day as to how we will apply the principles of God's law. We need to try and set an example. We want to help one another, set an example. Trying to make the right choices and setting an example of showing love to our neighbor by not running them down, not trying to get even, not any of these things that undermine a love for neighbor. We need to accept the fact that all must choose. To respect that right to choose. Another problem we get into sometimes is we get in one another's business. People get... I don't know why exactly it is. I guess I do know why it is. It's the answer is human nature. But it seems that live and let live is something that people have trouble with. It just really is. If they see somebody getting by with something that they don't think they ought to get by with, it just bothers them. To me, one of the accounts that just illustrates it so clearly, and I don't hear, it's not an account that I hear commented on very often, but it's back in John 21, and I think it would do us all good to read it on a regular basis because it's a pitfall that I think most every one of us, and I include myself, I think most of us have fallen into this pitfall. We have all done what Peter did at one time or another. Christ is having a very deep conversation with Peter. Peter had made a mistake that he didn't think he could make. Christ had talked to him back before the crucifixion. And Peter had sort of blustered and bragged, and, well, nobody's going to, everybody may forsake you, but I'll never leave you. I'll be right there, and boy, I'm not going to let them take you, and I'm going to do all this stuff. You remember the story. And of course, you also remember what happened. Peter got scared. His courage failed. His faith failed. And before the evening was over, he was cursing and swearing and denying that he ever knew, he didn't even know who Jesus of Nazareth was. Then he heard the cock crow. Then he realized the enormity of what he had done. Now this is after the resurrection. just prior to Christ's ascension into heaven. And he's talking with Peter, and he is bringing a point home about, do you love me? Feed my lambs. Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. Then he told Peter in verse 18, he said, when you were a young man, you bound yourself up, by putting your belt on or your clothes on, and you walked where you wanted to go. Time's coming when you're going to be old. Somebody else is going to do the binding. And it's not going to be putting the belt on either. They're going to tie you up, and they're going to take you where you don't want to go. Now this he said in verse 19, signifying by what death that Peter would glorify God. He told Peter, he said, Peter, there's some things that are going to happen. And when you were young, you went where you wanted to go. You made your own choices and decisions. Time is coming at the end of your life, somebody else is going to make some choices, and they're going to take you where you don't want to go. You're going to run into some things that are not going to be pleasant. But Peter, follow me. Follow me. In verse 20, you know what Peter did? He turned around and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following. He saw John walking back behind him a little ways. John, the one who leaned on his breast at supper and asked the Lord, who is it that betrays you? Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, verse 21, Lord, what about him? What shall this man be? What's he going to do? You've been talking to me. You've been talking to the rest of us. I hadn't heard you say anything to him. Surely he's not going to get out of this thing easier than I am. This is sort of the underlying statement. You're talking some heavy stuff. I'm going to take out. These things are going to happen to me. What about him? Surely you're not going to let him just get off scot-free. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what he's going to have to face? And Jesus said, verse 22, if I will that he tarry till I come, what's that to you? Follow you, me. Now, I'll tell you, verse 22 is a hard verse for us to apply. Christ said, look, Peter, what difference does it make if I tell John, look, John, you sit down here in a chair, prop your feet up, and just wait till I get back? What does that have to do with you, Peter? What difference does it make to you? What you need to do is follow me. See, that's what we all have to do. We have to follow Christ. We're responsible to follow him. Not to make sure that somebody else is. Or not to make sure that somebody else is not, quote, getting by with something that we got caught at doing, and we certainly don't want them to get off easier than we got off. People can sometimes get so busy about tending to somebody else's business, they forget about the kettle of soup they've got on the stove. They're out trying to check and make sure that the neighbor's soup doesn't burn, and theirs is the one that goes up. We all generally, most of us have our hands pretty well full if we tend to ourselves. We've done pretty well. Most of us have really more than we can do when we just tending to ourselves. Now, is that saying you shouldn't help someone? No. There are things you can do. You can set an example. You can certainly show love. There are a lot of things you can do, but we also have to recognize that God rears his own children. We all have our lessons to learn. Peter had lessons to learn. John had lessons to learn. They didn't go through exactly the same thing. Does that mean John got off easier than Peter did? Well, I don't know that was necessarily the case. John found himself at the end of his life seeing everything that God had built up through him and the other apostles, seeing it at the point of just totally dissipating and getting off the track. Incredible things happened in the end of the 90s and the beginning of the second century A.D. Incredible things. John lived up to where he was on the threshold of seeing some of those things. That could not have been an easy thing to go through. The point is, regardless of what John went through, regardless of what Peter went through, or Matthew, or James, or any of the rest of them, the way God is working in someone else's life is irrelevant to us. That's between them and God. We've got to give God room to work with His children, to rear His children. What we need to do? We need to follow Christ. We need to follow what we need to do. Jesus said, if I will that He tarry till I come, what's that to you? You follow me. And of course then, this is a perfect example of how rumors get started, because verse 23 says, then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that disciple should not die. Oh, this was the way that one was reported. Pretty soon word was out everywhere that John was never going to die. Christ had told John he wouldn't die. People heard that, and they believed that, and that got repeated. And you know what? Every decade that went by just proved the accuracy of that. By the time that the others were dead and John wasn't, and another 10 years went by, and then another 10 years went by, and then another 10 years went by, people just knew, they had that one all figured out. Well, John, the reason John's still alive, I know he's 93, but, John's not going to die. Notice what he says. Then went this saying abroad among the brethren that disciple should not die. Yet Jesus said not unto him, he shall not die. That's not what he said. But if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to you? That's what was said. This is the disciple which testifies to these things and wrote these things. And John said, that's not what he told me. He said, if I will, if that's what I want. But we all have gotten ourselves into difficulty by tending to one another's business. Peter was going to tend to John's business a little bit. He was just afraid that John was going to get off easier than he was. And we can all do that sometimes. If we really want to help one another, one of the best ways of helping one another is appreciating the value of live and let live. Let God rear His children. We each must work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Set an example. That's the most powerful teaching tool you have. Love your neighbor by not undermining him with gossip and backbiting and having an attitude of resentment and hostility. Have a forgiving attitude. That's showing love to your neighbor. Accept the fact that we all have to choose. Recognize that we all are working out choices, working out our lives before God. We've got to make choices. That's a part of the Christian life. Now, God tells us the choices to make, but we're all individually responsible for the choices we make, and we have to let one another make those choices. We have to let God work with each of us, recognizing that our responsibility is unchanging. We're responsible to follow Christ. Regardless of what anybody else does or says, we're responsible to do what we're supposed to do. And if we do that, we generally have done just about all that we're capable of doing. And, the other thing that we can all do to help one another is we can pray for one another. All the way through Paul's epistles, over and over, he says, pray for me. Pray for the brethren. We all ought to spend more time praying for one another. If we think about these things, we can recognize we are on a journey. We're on a journey that is dangerous, that is fraught with peril and difficulty, with adversity. But it is a journey in pursuit of a goal that is so far greater and so far transcends any other goal as to make it insignificant. There are dangers along the way. Whether it's dangers from the enemy or dangers from a hostile terrain or dangers from the dangers that lie in getting off the track. And there are those who've undertaken the journey that have not successfully completed it. But God tells us what to do, and He tells us that as we're doing what we need to do, there are things we can do to help one another. But the most important things have to do with setting an example, letting our example speak. Has to do with loving one another, recognizing our responsibility, the responsibility of each of us to make our choices. Be willing to let God deal with His children and rear His children in the way that He is dealing with each of us individually. We need to pray for one another. And as we do those things, we are pursuing what will take us to the successful completion of our journey. And we're contributing in a positive way to others successfully completing that journey as well. We have a tremendous goal before us. Let's never, ever lose sight of it. Let's be quick to encourage and to pray for one another. But let's also recognize the things that we can and must do if we're really going to be genuine help.